Okay, in this section, we're looking at what are the sources of international law, that is, where does it come from, and what can be used as kind of evidence, what can be used as standards in public international law. Because given that law can come out from a whole lot of different areas in different states, it's important to understand what is understood as law and why it's like that. Now, there tends to be 4 established places where public international law comes from. We're going to cover each of these briefly. The first one is custom, or the practices of states, and I've mentioned that briefly before. The second one is more positivist, and this is the conventions or treaties where the law is written down. The third one is called general principles of the law, and these are kind of understandings from domestic systems, which are so widespread that they have kind of effect at the international level. And the last one of these decisions and teachings and opinions and all these other areas where you have bits and pieces of international law kind of appearing, and we'll come back to that as well. I'm going to look at, with these 4 areas, how they relate to human rights. So the first one, in terms of customary international law. So as was mentioned before, custom means a kind of a practice which has been done for a while, like holding doors open or wine in Thailand, or similar kind of greetings and gestures of welcome in different cultures. Now, these are done generation after generation until they come just like a practice. And this is kind of what customary international law is. When states have been doing these things for such a long time, and they believe that they are law, even though they're not written down. So a good example of that is not arresting foreign heads of state. There's no treaty, there's nothing written down anywhere to say that states are not allowed to arrest foreign heads of state. But still, that's kind of done. It's just done out of this customary obligation. Now, while some states may have that written down, now in international law, it's just seen to be as a part of custom. You don't arrest a foreign head of state. So even as bad as a head of state is, if he visits your country, you don't arrest him. And we'll come back to look at an example of this in a second. Now, that was like the same with, say, diplomats. You don't arrest an ambassador or a foreign diplomat. Now, that used to be customary international law and was practiced for centuries and centuries, up until it became treaty law in the 1960s with the Vienna Convention of Diplomatic Relations. Okay. Now, also under customary law, we have these categories of jus cogens, so what's kind of compelling law which is seen to be so important that it has to be part of custom. And these are also known as peremptory norms. So these are laws which every state must accept. And these are mainly things like that the abolition of slavery and that torture is not allowed, neither is human trafficking and genocide. All these kind of like severe international crimes seem to be either peremptory norms or jus cogens, or even customary. Now, there is a distinction between peremptory norms and jus cogens and customary law, but we don't need to go into that. We can kind of say that they are all fairly similar. But these standards are important because there are many human rights which are seen to be at that level of customary. As it's at the bottom there, torture, slavery, the right to life, non-discrimination, war crimes, even things like not sending a refugee back to a country where they may be tortured is seen to be customary law. So plenty of human rights gets their power from custom, and that's why we need to understand that. Okay, so for example here, this is a picture of Omar al-Bashir, who currently has an arrest warrant out for him for crimes against humanity and war crimes because of what happened in Sudan, in Darfur, like 10 years ago. Now, if he travels to other countries, like here he's traveling to another African country, those African countries aren't going to arrest him because they say it's a part of custom. They can't arrest him because he's a foreign head of state. Now, that is kind of changing because we have seen foreign heads of state arrested for war crimes and things like that, dating back to General Pinochet in the late 1990s. So, customs do change. But you see here, there is this kind of tension where some states say, but it's customary, I can't arrest him because he's a head of state. The story now is that he's in jail. There was a coup and he was taken out of power, and he is now in jail in Sudan. But still, he's going to face jail at the domestic level. Okay, now next so we have treaties as well, which we're not going to cover because we'll look at treaties next, and treaties is an important part of human rights. Now, another area of sources of public international law is called general principles. Now, these are things which are found in most legal systems, and they're kind of so widespread and so accepted, they just seem to be international, like all legal systems should accept them. So this is something like the presumption of innocence. because it's assumed in all court systems, it's seen to be part of international law. You can't really have a legal system based on the presumption of guilt, or even ideas of habeas corpus or access to justice, or that, equality in arms between, say, the prosecution and the defence. All these are general principles. Often they have a lot to do with the rule of law and other human rights standards there. But it's about how the law functions. These general principles of the law are so widespread, it's assumed that that's how the law functions in all countries around the world. And the last standard is this area of decisions and teachings and opinions. And this is the more dynamic area where a lot of new standards a lot of new human rights comes. Of course, a lot of new international law comes. Of course, most international law tends to come through treaties, but you do find decisions and teachings also influencing international law. And this is true in human rights. So this can come through decisions from international courts, like the International Criminal Court, the ICC, International Court of Justice, ICJ, and the various other tribunals. Their findings can give findings which are now seen to be have a status in international law. That's also true with the treaty bodies, who through their processes can develop jurisprudence. For example, standards around Indigenous rights, and also standards on, say, non-discrimination based on sexuality, which comes out of decisions of the treaty bodies. Now, we'll cover treaty bodies later in the semester, but these are basically bodies attached to a human rights treaty who help states understand that treaty, and also can help people who feel that their rights are being violated by that treaty to get some kind of justice. We also have other forms of international law coming out of treaty body recommendations. And so these are kind of documents released by the treaty body in terms of how you understand the treaty. So for example, the right to water was kind of added as an economic, social and cultural right, even though it's not in the treaty itself, by a recommendation. So this is an example where international law has kind of come through an opinion. And you also have what's called juristic writings, or writings of expert bodies. And this can be a bit like, say, the Jogja principles around sexual orientation and gender identity. It can be in terms of interpreting economic, social and cultural rights, as we'll look in a couple of weeks with the Lindbergh and Maastricht principles there. They help understand economic, social and cultural rights. And so these are all examples where these teachings and decisions and opinions have enabled, expanded the understanding of human rights.